If I was to define historical simulation using as few words as possible, I would define it as learning from history by replaying the past. In this video, I will walk you through the basic mechanics of historical simulation, and in my next video, I will show you a somewhat more complicated historical simulation that is the very same with what you can see in the curriculum. So let's get started. Let us assume that we have the historical data for portfolio value starting from day 0, day 1, day 2, and all the way until day 498, day 499, and day 500. The historical data, namely these 501 data points, will be the basis of what might happen on day 401. And in the context of this example, you can think of day 501 as tomorrow and of day 500 as today. And because we have 501 data points, we would simulate 500 scenarios on what might happen on day 501. Scenario 1 will be based on what happened between day 0 and day 1. Scenario 2 will be based on what happened between day 1 and day 2. Scenario 499 will be based on what happened on day 498 and day 499, and scenario 500 will be based on what happened on day 499 and day 500. To keep things simple, let us assume that the portfolio value for day 500 is 68. And it is this 68 based on which the past will be replayed on. Let me show you. As you can see, scenario 1 is based on what happened between day 0 and day 1. And let us assume that the portfolio value on day 0 is 60 and the portfolio value on day 1 is 63. And this would imply that during this time, the portfolio value has increased with 5%. So the first scenario in the simulation would imply that the value today will increase with 5%. And this would mean that the portfolio value would be 71.4. In the very same fashion, scenario 2 is based on what happened between day 1 and day 2. And if we assume that the portfolio value for day 2 was 58, this would mean that during this time, the portfolio value has decreased with 8%. And if this is the case, our second scenario would imply that the value today will also decrease with 8%. And this calculation would lead to a value of 62.6. In the same fashion, scenario 499 is based on what happened between day 498 and 499. If we assume that the portfolio value on day 498 is 60 and the portfolio value on day 499 is 66, this would imply that during this time period the portfolio has increased with 10%. And if this is the case, scenario 499 would assume that the portfolio value today would also increase with 10%. This would mean a portfolio value of 74.8. And lastly, scenario 500 is based on what happened between day 499 and day 500. And if the portfolio value on day 500 is 68, this would imply that during this time, the portfolio value has increased with 3%. And if this is the case, scenario 500 would assume that today's value will also increase with 3%, which would lead to a value of 70. And it is these values based on which the loss distribution is defined, and this is because losses are defined as the simulated value for tomorrow minus the value for today. And let me illustrate this to you using our numbers. If you want to calculate the loss in the first scenario, you do the following. You take the simulated value for tomorrow and you subtract the observed value for today. And this would lead to plus 3.4. And because this is a positive value, this outcome is a return. If you want to calculate the losses for the second scenario, what you do is the very same thing. You take the simulated value for tomorrow and you subtract the observed value for today. And this would lead to minus 5.4. And because this is a negative value, scenario 2 is a loss. In a similar fashion, if you want to calculate the loss for scenario 499, you would do the following. You take the simulated value for tomorrow and you subtract the observed value for today. And this would lead to positive 6.8. And because this is a positive value, this outcome is a return. Lastly, for scenario 500, what you do is the following. You take the simulated value for tomorrow and you subtract the observed value of today. And this would lead to plus 2. And because this is also a positive value, scenario 500 is also a return. And it is these losses and returns based on which the loss distribution is being plotted, and it is this distribution based on which value at risk and expected shortfall is identified. From a testability perspective, you need to be aware that the loss distribution that is based on the historical observed data has the very same shape with the loss distribution that is simulated based on the historical data. And this is obviously because we are in essence replaying the past.